Welcome to Creative Tien channel. Today I want to show you a project I've been working on. It's a hand knitted throw, and I'm going to show you both machine knitting and hand knit version. And this is a very simple blanket, and I just cast on 200 stitches. I start with ribbing for the first 2 inches, and then ribbing on both edges, the first 10 stitches and the last 10 stitches. I want the center to be soft and thick, so I borrow the stitch from sock knitting. When we hand knit socks, for the heel part, we create a heel stitch that's alternating 1 plain stitch and 1 slip stitch, 1 plain and 1 slip stitch. And here is the back side. It creates a very soft cushion. And the only problem is that the hand knitting takes forever. So I will try to recreate it on the machine knitting. And the limit of the machine knitting is the size of the bed. Because I use LK150, that's only 150 stitches. And for the hand knit, I have 200 stitches. If you are making a baby blanket, it really doesn't matter. But if you want a bigger blanket, you might need to knit 2 pieces and seam it together. So first I want to show how I hand knitted to make this blanket. For the first stitches, I just have 1 by 1 ribbing. So the first stitch, I'll continue from below. It's a knit, and then purl. So after the 10 stitch of knit purl, I place a marker, and here is my marker, and I will start the heel stitch pattern. Now this row is the back side, so I will do purl stitch all the way. So purl stitch for every stitch of this row until the last 10 stitches. And then we'll do the 1 by 1 ribbing for the last 10 stitches. Here's my marker. I just use a binder clip. And then this is my last 10 stitch. You can see it's 1 by 1 ribbing. And I just follow the pattern. I start with purl, knit, and then we finish the backside row. You can see the 1 by 1 ribbing. And we turn over and do the same on the front side for the 1 by 1 ribbing. Now after the 10 stitches of 1 by 1 ribbing, we'll start the heel stitch. And it's very simple. It's just knit 1 stitch, and then slip 1 stitch. I will slip purlwise, and then knit the next stitch, and then slip the next stitch, and we just keep going. And in case you get confused sometimes, you can look at the size of the V below. When the smaller is the plain stitch. When there's a bigger V, that's a slip stitch. So you don't get confused. The bigger one is a slip stitch, and the small one is a plain stitch. And we'll just keep repeating these 2 rows. The front row has the alternating slip stitch, and the back row is just the purl stitch. And that's how we do the hand knitting of the heel stitch blanket. And after you knit until the length you like, you can do a few rows of the 1 by 1 ribbing to match the beginning. Maybe 2 or 3 inches of 1 by 1 ribbing, and then you can just bind off. So this is a very simple and practical blanket because I like it that's really soft and thick. So that's what it looks like. It's the back side. So let's see how to knit a heel stitch on a knitting machine. And the heel stitch is basically slip stitch on every other needle, so it creates some thickness On the LK150 knitting machine, to make a slip stitch, you have to change the side lever to the circle and the rustle lever to number 2. And this is a setting for plain knitting. The side lever goes to the triangle, so we have to push down to the circle. That means if your needles are in the B position, it will slip and not knit. And if your needle is in the D position, it will knit and go back to the B position, the standard knitting position. So let's try a sample here. I already started with a few plain knitting, the stockinette stitch, and now I'm going to select needle for the slip stitch. The slip stitch will be in the B position, so I will pick every other needle to the D position. I have odd numbers of needles, so the end needle will knit. That's on the D position. And we know the needles in the B position will slip. So we set up our side lever to the circle and rustle lever to number 2. And it's same on the other side, so we are ready to knit. And the next row is just plain knitting, so we can change the side lever back to the triangle and knit 1 row. And now we go back to the slip stitch again. Since we are alternating the slip stitch and the plain knitting, we'll keep the right side of the side lever to the circle for slip stitch, and the left side of the side lever to the triangle for plain knitting. So we are ready to do the slip stitch again. We select the same needle. And then we can knit 1 row. See, it creates a slip stitch. The needles in the B positions are not knitted. And now we go back, we have to do the plain knitting. So the left side is the setting for plain knitting. And we can see this row is plain knitting. And we just continue doing this way. When the carriage go to the right side, we will select the needle. I select the same needles every time, but you can experiment with alternating the needles. I don't have to change the setting because this one is slip stitch, the other side is plain knitting. So now let's do the slip stitch. And then next row, plain stitch. And that's what it looks like. And we just keep repeating that. Select the needles before you do the slip stitch. And just knit 1 row. And then knit back. This is plain stitch. And we repeat. We select needles. Knit 1 row. And knit back. So you can see we have 1 row of slip stitch and 1 row of plain stitch. And next we want to try knit 2 slip rows and then 1 plain row. So we have to set up the lever both sides to the circle for slip stitch. And then we select the needles. The B position will be the slip stitch. So that's the slip stitch. And we want to do it again. We select the same needle. And then we're going back to the plain knitting. So we return this one to the triangle, the side lever, for plain knitting because we're going this direction. So we only need to change this setting on the right side. And the next row will be the slip stitch again. So make sure the side lever is a circle, and we select all the stitches again. And the next row we'll do the same, the slip stitch, the circle, and select all the needles. And then we are going to do the plain stitch. Set the lever back to the triangle. And we are going to do a few more rows and see the difference. So I take it off the machine, and this is what it looks like. Here is a cast on edge. The first few rows are the plain stockinette stitch, and then we have the slip stitch every other row. And that's the back side, the slip stitch, and then plain stitch. And we try to have 2 rows of slip stitch. That's this section in the middle, and you can see the loop gets bigger, and it also creates more dense fabric. You can see it in the back. This is a section for the 2 rows of the slip stitch and then 1 row of plain knitted, and this is the slip stitch every other row. So this part is thicker and more cushion than the slip stitch every row. So if I want to make a blanket, I will use this stitch here with 2 rows of slip stitch and then 1 row of plain knitting. And you can experiment with 3 rows of the slip stitch and 1 row of plain knitting. It might start to get tight. Depending on the yarn and the tension you use, you will have different result. But this is a nice slip stitch pattern, similar to the heel stitch for the hand knit socks, and I will definitely try something like that when I need some thickness in the fabric. I think it creates an interesting pattern. I hope you like this video. Thank you for watching, and talk to you next week.